Alrighty. So can you start off by telling me a bit about your mother's life before 9/11? What kind of person was she, and what were her aspirations and dreams?
Mhm. So my mother was Jamaican, that's important to give a little background about sort of what her value proposition and values were. She was one of four sisters and two brothers, and she got married young at 19. When she got married, she got me as a part of the bargain. So I was 3 years old when she became my mother. My father and she lived in Brooklyn. They met at work, and um, she was fun. She loved musicals. She loved books. She loved museums, libraries, and um, and she loved being a mother. And so I have a younger sister as well, who's 8 years younger than me, my sister Joanne. Um, but in terms of what she did at work, she was very um, focused on adding value and supporting the people who worked with her. And she was able to elevate in her role at Fiduciary Trust, which is where she worked in the South Tower of the World Trade Center, to becoming a vice president and essentially managing the area in which she was in finance. And so, um, yeah, I mean, when I think of my mother, I just think of somebody smart. She was a go-to person in terms of not just having family members in her circle, but a lot of friends as well, and people who she mentored too. So, yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And what were some of the challenges that she faced as a Black woman prior to 9/11?
It was interesting. I looked at the question and I was like, well, I'm sure this is probably across the board, but the challenges of trying to quotation mark balance being a mother and a wife and a sister and a daughter and a friend and all of those other things, and also having a career is the ultimate challenge of Black women, and she was not exempt from that.
Yeah. And tell me a little bit how your family found out about the events that occurred on 9/11.
Um, so so I'll tell you about my experience. I don't want to speak for them, but I can tell you a little bit about what I know about their how my other family members found out. So I live in California, so it was 3 hours earlier. And I just happened to be an early riser that day. And I was living with my boyfriend at the time. And he came into the room and said, "You have to come see what's happening on television." And I was like, "No, I'm getting dressed. Like, what are you talking about?" And we had just recently gotten a huge big screen TV, like a 70-inch TV. And so I walked out into the living room, and what I saw was, the North Tower burning, and then the repeated footage of them showing the planes flying into the plane flying into the one tower. And so immediately I get on the phone, and my mother, since I was in high school, she had an 800 number that you can reach her at. So I was like, good, let me just go ahead and call this 800 number. And it was fast busy, which meant that the line was down, and I just kept calling, kept calling. And then I called my father, and he was crying. And so until that moment, I wasn't like scared. I was like, oh, this is terrible. But I wasn't scared because thinking my mother was involved, right? It was just very much like, this is a terrible thing. She'll be shaken up by it, but it's not her. And the reason why is because in 1993, when the World Trade Center was bombed then, and she was in the building, but she got out. So I was like, oh, like this is just, something else has happened that is really terrible, but my mother's not in there. But then when I spoke to my father and he was crying, I was like, what's going on? And he could barely speak. And so it was, he said that he had spoken to my mother and that she was scared and she was crying too. So again, because he'd spoken to her, in my mind, I'm like, okay, that's messed up, but we'll still see him later. And then um, so there wasn't a we know that she's gone moment, but there wasn't a we know what has happened to the World Trade Center. And my aunts and everybody came up from Florida to help search, and we made flyers. There's all of those things that happen. But when I decided I was finally able to come back I didn't tell my father it was flying because, everybody was scared at that point. Like, he didn't know what was going to happen again, etc. And I did not want him to be worried about me at the same time as worrying about everything else and still being optimistic. And so that's kind of the story.
And thank you for sharing that with me. And of course, some people say that coverage of 9/11 tends to be whitewashed.
Mhm.
Do you feel at all similarly? And if so, how has this like impacted you and your family's journeys towards healing from this?
I think that the majority of people who were killed in September 11th were white. So that's one piece of it. But I also think that the media tends to focus on white people and that tragedy because it's a part of how white supremacy shows up in our society. I'm a diversity consultant. This is what I do and speak about for a living. And so when you did see people of color, and I will group them in, not just Black people, but people of color in general, it was usually spoken about in a service capacity, right? So like the people who are working in Windows in the World, who were cooks or dishwashers or folks who were cleaners, that's what you heard about more. You didn't hear about people who were executives, who were people of color. And you definitely didn't hear about executives until who were Black, right? And so it's part of why I decided there needed to be a space on the internet that talked about my mother and who she was, because if other people weren't going to do it, then I was going to. That's a part of my legacy as her daughter, is to make sure that she's not forgotten, and not just as a Black person who was in there, but a Black person who was in there who had tremendous value, right? And everybody who was in, people have value, right? So it is what it is, but um, you do tend to see more of um, white people being covered. And I don't think that is a deliberate thing, but I do think it's a way that people have biases that show up maybe unconsciously or consciously, right? I can't speak about how the media has chosen to do what they're doing, but I can suspect.
Right, for sure. And in what ways has your mother's loss impacted your own life and
Oh,
maybe the life of your loved ones as well?
um, loss of any mother, right, is devastating. To have your mother murdered in such a public and international way is the grief was no longer ours only. It wasn't a private grief. It's a very public grief. And I think that makes it a lot harder, right? So that, um, they say that grief comes in waves, but I know that every 9/11, my phone is going to like go crazy because people are going to remember me only because of my mother being killed. And, if she had died in any other way, it may be that people would remember, but not in the same way, right? So it's, even if I decided that year I want to be, in a space where I'm just thinking about how much I love her and it's happy, people will be like, oh, Paula, I remember your mother died on this day. And also this happened, and this happened for 9/11. Right? It's all the connections. And I try to remind people that not only did my mother die on 9/11, and so it was the murder of my mother that was the tragic piece of that day, but I also am an American. I also am a New Yorker. It's so all of those levels of grief are profoundly impact who I am and how I experience it. But to answer your question, when we were navigating the whole process of the Victims Compensation Fund and my mother's death in general, there was a lot of different questions that were posed to us about um, what my mother did. So I don't know if you understand the process, but when you have any kind of compensation fund, they have to figure out to calculate how much you should get and how, right? And so that is done by saying like, well, how many times did your mother wash the dishes? Did she make the bed twice a day? Like, so literal things that your mother would do because she's your mother were asked of you. And it was such a dehumanizing experience. I remember thinking to myself, for me, it was like losing my North Star. My mother and I were very close. We spoke every single day. When people have asked me before about things that I remember, one of the things that I remember most about my mother is how much she loved clothes and how she was so what's the word? She was so adamant that you had to look a certain way when you left the house, right? And she modeled that. And it's something that I had taken on. I talk about personal branding and how you show up all the time And it really, for me, my mother, without knowing it, she was prepping me to be her and to fill her role when she wasn't there. And I say without knowing it because I assumed that she didn't know it. But there's a story that I don't know that I've told that often, but the week before my mother was killed, it was my parents' 20th anniversary. And they had gone on vacation many times, lots of times. And my mother never gave me any information like other than like this is where we're going and this is the flight. But the time in 2001, she gave me the lawyer's number, the financial advisor, um, and there was another number. And I was like, thanks. I still have the paper where she wrote it on. But that was, I didn't have to think about it, or my father was like, I don't know, like, I don't know what to do. And I'm like, oh, my mother gave me all this information. I know who to call. I know what to do. When otherwise it would have been us having to find a lot of things that because she was, sort of very alpha, and took care of a lot of things that I might not have known. And I lived in another state at that time, right? So um, to come back around, my sister lost her mother when she was 16. I lost my mother when I was 24. My father lost his wife of 20 years. We didn't know, being without her. And so it was like when the towers fell, we all fell and we had to build ourselves back up. And I don't think 22 years later that we're not the same. I have two children and I'm married. Actually, I'm going to celebrate my 20th anniversary this year too. Um, I still miss my mother every single day. Any story that you'll hear about her is about either how much fun she loved to have, how she liked to cook, how she loved to read, or how she gave great advice, right? It's that in all of the things that she did, she impacted people deeply. Deeply.
Yeah, for sure. And what are some misconceptions you think surrounding Black 9/11 victims, survivors, and first responders you believe should be maybe addressed or challenged?
I think the misconception is connected to the lack of representation in stories, right? So the biggest misconception is that there aren't many, right? That there aren't any. And then from there, I would say that, like I mentioned before, that if there were any, which we know there are, that they were only in the service industry, which again is a part of sort of the story around 9/11, but that there were several, I won't say a lot because it wasn't a lot, but several people who were in the executive role and who were Black, and who were killed on September 11th. And we should remember that. We should remember everybody, all 3,000 odd people, but understanding that within that group, there was diversity. And within that grouping, there was additional diversity. And it's important that we honor everyone. So much of how we honor people is through the lens of Americans, right, who were killed in 9/11. And oftentimes the word American equates to white, and it's not. It is not. And I could go on and on about that, but it's not. And so we just need to honor and acknowledge um, who we have lost, and how we identify the people who were part of this, who were all in one way or the other, not, victims and heroes, right? So yeah.
Yeah, sure. And how has your family been able to honor your mother's memory? How have you been able to honor your mother's memory in the years following 9/11?
Well, I honor my mother's memory every single day, and I do that in multiple ways. Number one, I sort of have a practice in kind of connecting with her, whether I do it like out loud or just internally. But I have a picture of my mother who's like right across from where I'm sitting, and I sort of sometimes will just say mommy, like, to talk to her. As I mentioned, and I don't know if you have seen, but there's a page on my website that is specifically about my mom, and that was an important piece for me to create and to curate, because I wanted to make sure that there was some place that people could learn about her, who she was. And I'm committed to making sure that stays on there forever, to a point of asking some of the other questions. But we share pictures. Like I mentioned, we have conversations and talk about memories. In my dad's house, we have the wedding photo, like just things that sort of remind us of her. Um, I often when I speak, I talk about something that she used to say to me or said to me, often, which was you can be the wind or you could be the leaf, which to me I take as, you can either shape your world or you can let the world shape you. And it's sort of having some ownership over who you are and how you navigate in the world. And that is a legacy that I think she's left with a lot of people. As I mentioned, the people she worked with, our family and friends, my cousins, everybody was touched in some way by her sisters. Um, and so we honor her by remembering the value and remembering her values and trying to live our life in a way that she would be proud of. And I, in particular, try to mother my kids in the way that would align with how she mothered me, although definitely not the same. I'm not the mother that she was. The process and the choice of reading names each year that, it's a lottery, but I've had the opportunity to do it more than a couple times. And it is, for me, the African tradition of actually saying out loud names is a spiritual connection to ancestors, right? And so I think of it, whether or not the people who put it together know that when you say a name, right, of ancestors, you are calling their memory, you're calling them and their spirit back to you. And so for me, it's a very special thing because you get a section of names, but it's not necessarily the names of your victim, the victim that you're connected to, but you get a chance to say that person's name and a short message before you move on to the next group. And what I have loved about the experience each time is that I'm with other victim family members. And so I get to hear, while we wait about the people who they lost and that they loved. About, you know, one year I was with a young child who was just, I think like 7 or 8, who had a hard time, reading the words, but thinking like this is the grandchild of somebody who was killed, who didn't have a chance to know the person, but understands the importance of remembering that this is somebody who was lost and who was important to their family.
How do you,
So
like you said, like share your mother's memory with your children? How do you tell them about her?
I just do. I say, this Grandma Donna, like that was, who raised mommy. I talk about the experience of me being raised by her. One of my first memories of my mother was of how soft her hands were. Like, with the experience of like lotioning your kid. And I being the kid, remembering how soft her hands were. And I laugh with my kids and be like, you don't lotion, and I need to come lotion you when they were little, and be like, my mother used to do this for me. Or, I don't cook, but father cooks. And saying like your grandmother used to cook this. Or when we have cookies at Christmas, or just any of the things that we used to do together, even to the point of going to museums. That was something my mother loved to do. Or, going to the library, like I said, and musicals. I can't tell you how many times I've had my kids sit down and force them to watch, Mary Poppins with me, or any of the other things that my mother used to do. So it is not hard at all for me um, to let them know who she was, because it is who they are experiencing as a mother, just one step over, right? Like my father, I should also say my father too has been very deliberate about sharing with his grandchildren who their grandmother was. And so together we all do. And even my husband, who didn't have a chance to meet my mother, I think at this point he now knows more, like in the space to be able to say, like, there's something your grandmother would do, even if I'm not the one saying it, because of the stories that he's heard. And I always say that my husband and I were together because of my mother. Because when I think about what I want people to know about my mother, and then also about my family, in particular, and my experience as family members of a victim of September 11th, is that she existed, right? Is that the same way we should think about the lens of whose story is missing from anything that we see, right? To be able to challenge and to have really thought about the stories that we're getting from the media. It's important to remember um, that there's often stories that are not being told deliberately, and there's often stories that are not being told because of bias. And when we do hear those stories, to share them, right? That it's not um, I love talking about my mother. So every single time somebody reaches out to me, I'm like, yes, of course I will tell. Because the more that I do that, the more people I'll be able to counteract the fact that they have not heard. And even 22 years later, it's the story, the experience, um, seems like yesterday to some people, including myself. And to understand that we are collectively at grief from that experience. Still, the trauma of 9/11 is very similar to our trauma as being in the pandemic, in that there were so many people lost, right? And each of those people had a story, and we are, if we really want to honor their existence, we should um, actively try to find out who they were and what we lost. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thank you so much for talking to me today. I really appreciate
Oh,
it.